Hello, I'm Merve Emre and pleased to welcome you to the 2021 Brooklyn Book Festival for A Place Called Home, a conversation with Rachel Kushner, Jerald Walker, and Aminatta Forna. Before we begin, I want to let you know that books by authors in this program can be purchased in the link below. I don't know what I'm pointing to, but I hope that you do. So I'm going to introduce our authors, and then I will give a very, very brief spiel about the theme for this panel, and then we will get started. So Rachel Kushner is the best-selling author of 3 novels, the Booker and NBCC Award shortlisted The Mars Room, The Flamethrowers, a finalist for the National Book Award, and a New York Times top 10 book of 2013, and Telex from Cuba, a finalist for the National Book Award. Her new book, The Hard Crowd, Essays 2000 to 2020, was published in April. Gerald Walker is the author of National Book Award finalist, How to Make a Slave and Other Essays, The World in Flames, A Black Boyhood in a White Supremacist Doomsday Cult, and Street Shadows, a memoir of race, rebellion, and redemption, winner of the 2011 PEN New England L.L. Winsip Award for Nonfiction. His essays have been widely published and anthologized, including 5 times in Best American Essays. The recipient of the University of Texas at Austin's James A. Missioner Fellowship and a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, Walker is a professor of creative writing at Emerson College. And Aminatta Forna is the author of the novels Ancestor Stones, The Memory of Love, The Hired Man, and the memoir, The Devil That Danced on the Water. And her latest is The Window Seat. Forna's books have been translated into 22 languages. Her essays have appeared in Brick, Freeman's, Granta, The Guardian, Kenyon Review, Literary Hub, the New York Review of Books Daily, The Observer, and Vogue. She is currently director and Lannan Foundation Chair of Poetics at Lannan Center for Poetics and Social Practice at Georgetown University. So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you for these wonderful, wonderful books. It was really a joy to read them. So I thought I would kick things off by trying to find a way to put your books in conversation with one another. And one thing that the 3 of us were speaking about before the panel officially started was who needs home? And whether this topic, A Place Called Home, is actually desirable or appropriate to the books under consideration. And I had a sort of longer spiel that I wrote to all of you, but I thought maybe a simpler way to start would just be to ask, who needs this theme? Is this an appropriate way to describe any of your books? What does home mean to you? Is it a useful concept, or can we do away with it altogether? And if we do, what does that let us speak about? So whoever wants to go first can jump right in. Or I can call on you, whatever you want.
I think we need direction.
I'm gonna
mind starting. I don't mind starting.
I'm gonna go ahead.
Some feelings about it. So I have an essay called Home, or Heim, as it is in Shetlandic, and it's an essay inspired by a visit that I made with my mother and younger brother to the Shetland Islands, which is where half my family come from. The other half are West African, and I grew up all around the world as a result of circumstance, but also my stepfather's diplomatic career and choice. But you know what the essay looks at is exactly this: what does home mean? And my grandmother's extreme, what I call homestruckness, like she couldn't leave home, and my mother couldn't wait to get away from home and never went back. So I look at these 2 contrasting ideas of home, and as a result of both those women, but more specifically my mother, I grew up with a very, 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 very fluid sense of home. I really don't mind where it is, and home to me is where my stuff is. Home to me is where I pay my tax. Home to me is where my family is. You know, home to me is wherever I've chosen to settle. And I feel at home anywhere I go, really, unless somebody chooses to make me feel otherwise. But so long as the place is either welcoming or neutral, I feel very comfortable.
Rachel or Gerald, do either of you want to jump in?
Okay, I'll take a shot at it. I have an essay in my collection called "Once More to the Ghetto," and it's about me returning to Chicago after a long absence by design with my two sons, who know two things about Chicago. One, the horror stories I told them about, and the horror stories they saw or see on television whenever some bad thing happens and there's some shooting that's well publicized. And they say, "Daddy, is that where you're from? It's true, it's as bad as all that." And I say, some places are that bad, but you'll never have to know because we're not going back. And then my mother's 80th birthday was approaching. And of course, I had to go back to celebrate that with her. And my boys would accompany me and my wife. And they were horrified to return. And so home had become this monster that I had created in my own mind about the place that I was raised, and this mythical monster for my children who knew about it only through the stereotypical images that were by and large false. Home is also where I get my material. And so I love it for that reason, but that material I can retrieve from the comfort of my Boston home. In this instance, however, we were going physically. And so it was a matter of the conception of home that we had created coming into contact with the reality of home some years removed from when I first had that definition of home made for me, which is to say when I was a child there. So I had one belief of it from long ago, and we were going to see how it matched up with what we encountered when we arrived. The title of the essay, you probably recognize, I stole from E.B. White's Once More to the Lake, which is really an essay all about nostalgia. And I realized once we made the trip, once the truth of the place was revealed to my sons and re-revealed to me, that where I was raised is not a place that's full of all of the awful things you see on the news and the reports you hear, but home is a very positive, affirmative place of community and loving that I had somehow forgotten about over the distance of time. So, so home then, in short, which I think it's too late for that, is a place that is similar to something that Rachel wrote in one of her pieces in her amazing essay collection. I think you'll correct me, Rachel, if I get this wrong, but that the person who writes the memoir is not the person who is being written about, that time separates you from that place. And so the home that I had created in my head is separate from the home that I actually lived through. And I discovered a way to unite my two different homes once I made the visit.
I guess maybe that's a natural place for me to jump in. It's fascinating to hear you both. Gerald, thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, I think I said the person who writes about the experience is no longer the person who had the experience. And I wasn't thinking specifically of memoir when I wrote that, but it could be applied to it easily, but perhaps also fiction. It's funny how there was some reaction to this theme of home. I think for myself, I over-associated it with the domestic, and maybe by inference, a desire to domesticate. Like, I sometimes see an eagerness to attach to the writer's own biography as a method for talking about a book or couching what a book is about. And I always think no. And with my new essay collection, it's for me, it's like meant to be one coherent book where you start on the first page and read all the way to the end, but it traverses quite a lot of different territory that's not about me and not about where I come from. So I was a little hesitant, but hearing you both talk, I can also cop to the idea that there is some about home, not just in the book, especially the title essay, The Hard Crowd, which is about, I guess, a very specific San Francisco that I'm from and experienced with a lot of other people who are also from it. And it's gone, and it's not about gentrification per se at all. That place, whatever it be for any individual, is also gone because it's your past and it continues to live in your mind and actually take up a larger and larger share of residency there over the years when you enter the second half of your life. At least that's my own experience. And so I wanted to write about that and what my conversation is like with these people in places that are no longer there. And it became a kind of psychogeography, if you will, of these specific neighborhoods, and especially the Tenderloin, which kind of really shaped my young mind. And thinking about the panel, I was started to feel kind of stunned to think that sometimes there's an integer of your youth that's really, objectively speaking, just very few years, and yet comes to have an enormous kind of impact as a primal scene, in terms of who you are later. And then you can just breeze through a stretch of 15 years of being a writer and writing novels and not be taking in like a lot of dents in the sense of experience, the good trauma that will shape you. Of course, there are exceptions to that, but like there is a kind of density of experience when you're young. And maybe that's what I was writing about. But also in my last novel, The Mars Room, that and this title essay, The Hard Crowd, are kind of about the same place. And it's a place that I know intimately, I guess, and very well. I don't know. It's just something about the word home sounded so cozy. So I was a little bit just hesitant about that.
I mean, Rachel, both you and Aminatta write very beautifully about the kinds of intimacies that are forged when you are away from what one might call home, whether you're on the road and sort of encountering strangers, or Aminatta, in your first essay, you write about the community of the plane. And Gerald, in your previous answer, you mentioned that sense of home being linked to a kind of affirmative embrace of community. So does that word, how do you think about the relationship between home and community? I mean, are communities things that are forged when you're away from the domestic, from the comforts of the domestic, or is it centrally rooted in the domestic space? Anyone?
I feel like that word community is getting used a lot, and I'm sometimes worry that it's kind of getting overused. There's a lot of my community, and well, I don't know how it relates to my own writing, to be honest. I mean, there's a way in which it signals a space that may not have value in the marketplace, but that people are arguing is precious to the sustaining of a life that's lived with meaning. Um, then again, we live in like the most atomized society in the world if you judge atomization based on like whether people belong to, churches and youth groups and labor unions and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. It's not something I think about a whole lot, but maybe in the essay that I wrote about a refugee camp that's technically inside Israel's borders, but is Palestinian, and 85,000 people live there in 1 square kilometer. I think I was sort of trying to feel out the ways in which it was a community, which it very, very much was, and that was what I experienced most strongly. And I think that the index for me of the level and types of communities that it was were flagged by my feeling acutely of being an outsider. Like I like that feeling sometimes because it seems as though there's going to be a whole elaborate and even exquisite set of rules and mores that cannot be easily grasped, that you are going to have to work hard paying attention and listening and putting in the time and opening your mind and hearing what people are saying. And there are still things you won't know, but maybe you can feel them and try to write into that unknowingness of how other communities are working.
A reader said to me about my collection, it's interesting how much of an outsider you are, in that I look at things, you know, and that's what interests me as a writer, is looking at things rather than and reacting to them, but not necessarily placing myself at the center of it. I've lived in very many communities, and I don't have, you know, I've had very different experiences of them, and rather like home, I don't necessarily hold it all up to be a great thing. Now, my childhood was mainly spent in Sierra Leone in West Africa, and my father was a political prisoner, and the community we lived in was turning on itself and becoming very hostile. And people were spying on each other and reporting on each other and getting each other put into prison. And that's been a theme in my writing a lot, about civil conflict and what communities do to each other in a civil conflict, how quickly it breaks apart. I've also lived in parts of London in a really, you know, what I think of as a wholesome community, a community that and actually where I live in London, I still regard myself as living there because I spend part of the year there and we have our house there. It's called a created community, and you know, lots of lovely left-wing newspapers like The Guardian write pieces about us, Telegraph Hill, the created community. And it was a group of artists and writers who decided they wanted a certain kind of life, and you know, have done all kinds of things, including running our own cafe and our own arts festival and things like that. And then I came to live in America, where community is extremely fragmented in a way that I just have never experienced in my life. You know, in Sierra Leone, even if the wider community is pretty fragmented, things tend to orbit around the extended family much more. Blood holds a lot of value. But this is the most, to use Rachel's word, atomized place I've ever set foot in. You know, where it just feels like people have become interchangeable with other people, and humans don't seem terribly invested in the people who live around them. Which I suppose is why we have the rise of identity politics the way we do, people looking for an identity in some other form, be it, you know, race, sex, gender, sexuality, or but you know, I wonder if that is what's replacing the sense of community. That's what people are looking to. But it's not. Communities come in very many forms, and they're not always warm and cozy.
No, well, I sorry, Gerald, may I say something very, very
Please,
quickly?
sure.
Well, I thought one point of really wonderful contact between your collection and Rachel's was, you know, Rachel has the essay that begins with being on a ship and everybody looking around to see who would be the first person you would all decide to sacrifice and eat if the ship were
Yes.
something were to go terribly awry, or the kind of skepticism and the sort of malice that can come out in these communities that form just for a moment in time, and that seems so opposed to your vision, Aminatta, of the airplane being a place where everyone is sort of united in this sort of brief utopian moment up in the sky above all of our worldly care.
Well, that actually has somewhat changed since I took up domestic travel within the United States. So when I wrote the essay, I'm actually always writing about international travel, you know, getting on the plane in one country and getting off the plane in another country. I'm not quite sure what would happen in a moment of crisis on an American domestic flight. But anyway, that aside, I should turn to Gerald to give us his idea of community.
It's based on something you just said, Aminatta, about people looking for home. I remember back in sometime in the mid-90s, my wife was about to do her field dissertation research in Zimbabwe, where her father was born and my wife was born in Zambia. And when I announced to my family that we would be going to spend a year in this region, my sister in particular, who was very Afrocentric, thought, in fact, she said the phrase, "You're going home." And she threw a big party called Gerald's Going Home Party. And she invited everybody, and my sister arrived with her kente cloth robes and hats and all of this stuff. And then they poured the libations, and they did all these things to celebrate the fact that I was returning home, which I thought was a little bit absurd until the moment the plane was just about to touch the tarmac. And I teared up. And it occurred to me, because I've never bought into the notion that my home as an African American is some other place. But when I arrived, I thought, or I didn't think, I felt that there was something to that notion. And then, to use another phrase that Aminatta just used, that it's not always cozy. When you try to give your definition of home to someone else, especially if they are the people who are the host of what you believe your home to be. And so once we arrived into this place, and I walked around in a daze, and I encountered people who would ask me, listen, why do you people call yourselves African American? You are not African, you are American. Why do you say that? And I found myself trying to defend this thing that I never bought into, but I felt compelled to do it because there were stakeholders back home waiting for me to return with news from home. And I didn't want to return with the news that the home is not the home. And yet, after spending a year in this place and being met with people, very friendly people, love them, can't wait to go back. We haven't been back yet, but I'm looking forward to it. But after being told in no uncertain terms that this is not your home, you are not African, this is not your culture, and it's okay, I had to return to my sister waiting to hear the news and say, guess what? You don't have to go there. You're already home. This is our home. And it was as if I had just returned from the mountaintop to say that was not a burning bush after all. That was just a light reflecting off a piece of glass. There's nothing there. And everybody was devastated. And they rejected my news, but I accepted it. And it was this trip, which was supposed to have me understand that I was from some other place, that really crystallized for me that my home was actually the place from whence I had departed.
I mean, that, I think that connects really nicely to your first comment, Gerald, which is about the necessity of having to leave in order for the concept of home to stabilize or to become clear. You can sort of only see it through your rear view. What is it, a window or a mirror? I don't drive. I'm so sorry. Which one? It's one of those.
It's from the window seat.
Right. Right. Well, you can only see it once some sort of distance has opened up between you and what was previously sort of merely a place, but now, gained some kind of stable identity as home. And it makes me think that it's an immense privilege to be able to choose when you get to leave and where you get to go. And Rachel, your essay about the refugee camps made me think a little bit about this too, about how some people have to redefine home out of necessity, whereas others get to redefine it out of choice. So I'm just worried, I'm not worried, I'm just wondering if that's another sort of tension that's operative across many of the essays that are in your collections.
Trying to think. I mean, sometimes there's, maybe this is a tangent of that, like a mythology of home that is useful to a writer and even conscious, and may refer to a place that never existed. but then comes to be concretized and to exist in the way that the writer uses it. Like Marguerite Duras, for instance, who I write about, her last name is manufactured. It's the name of the village that her father was from. No one in her family was named Duras. They were Donadieu, I think. I don't speak French, so pardon the accent. And she went with Duras because she had this idea of what that could mean as a sort of earthiness, a kind of facticity of place, a village where people had been living and doing things the same way in a department of France where they speak a very kind of earthy provincial language. The S is pronounced, which is considered kind of crude in the French language. And not just Francophiles, but even French people will sometimes say Duras. And Duras was Duras. And she's using this place name of this village to try to, I don't know, like manifest a certain mythology of herself. I just want to say something really quickly. Listening to Jerald speak was so compelling, and it reminded me of reading Frank B. Wilderson's book Incognegro, when he goes to apartheid South Africa with all of these dreams and hopes and expectations, and none of them are met. But of course, in other ways, he embarks upon a painful education there of what he is and what he isn't. I don't know. It just reminded me of that very strongly listening to you speak.
I was, in fact, when I was, I thought of it when I was reading Aminatta's, one of your essays is about, I think you called them the returners.
Returnees.
Returnees who come to Sierra Leone believing that they in fact are returning to some place, a similar sort of experience. But I wondered, what was that like? You talk about it in your essay, but if you could mention now, what was it like for you to be kind of on the receiving end of people who are coming looking for a place that probably doesn't exist?
Yeah, I was going to say something about that, because the narrative of slavery and home and exile is not the same in Sierra Leone as it is for African Americans. I mean, slavery existed in Sierra Leone, and we know it existed not only all over Africa, but in most parts of the world there. And there are there's some very, very interesting stories in oral culture, about oral history, about slavery, and the idea that the narrative that I uncovered was about white men, and white men were considered to be drowned people because the body of a black person goes white if it's immersed in water for a long time. And so they were thought to be the souls of drowned people, and they built their houses on the sea. And the reason that they had green eyes and pale hair, or blue eyes and pale hair, was because they drank seawater and ate fish. And they were sent by the devil that they worshipped. They were sent to capture people in what wasn't then called Sierra Leone, obviously, but anyway, Africans, West Africans, and take them and feed them to this person, to this devil who lived across the sea. So that's sort of it, I suppose in the West African way of looking at it, people vanished, right? They vanished, and nobody knew what became of them. But then at the point where we began to really see stories on TV and popular culture of African Americans, and everything for us was so terrible. At that point, Sierra Leone was descending into a terrible civil conflict. So it was kind of hard to persuade anybody in Sierra Leone that we were home, right? We were where anybody would want to come. There were these two different narratives, but the other thing I would say is that it is particularly poignant for African Americans, this idea of Africa as the home continent. But I do see it everywhere with Americans in particular and New World people in general. And one of the things you see in Scotland the whole time is the Scottish Americans of Scots descent going back and going around the castles and getting their tartans. And now it doesn't have the same poignancy because they were not snatched from those places, but many of the Scots did leave because of the enclosures and things like that. They were effectively forced out. They just came to a kind of different sort of opportunity when they came to America. So it's a sort of new world experience, I think, of constantly trying to find some lost past.
I mean, I suppose now that you're in the US, I wonder, has Brexit made you think differently about this concept, about what it means, not just for a person to have a home that is particular or national, but for a country to be part of a larger system that it could understand as a home that it's now sort of broken off from?
Well, I think our lives are affected by politics in ways that we often choose not to see. But I think Brexit has been a very dramatic illustration of that. That, you know, millions of people who thought themselves European, who had invested in living and working in different countries in Europe, were suddenly pulled out of that, whether it was, you know, French and Polish people living in Britain, or whether it was Brits who were living in France or Spain or Holland. You know, anecdotally, I know so many people whose lives have been riven by this. And it's only going to carry on that way, really, because, you know, the chance that Scotland devolves is very high, and Ireland as well. So we're going to find a greater fragmentation, and the idea of home, I think, for some people is narrowing, even as it was expanding for other people who were Europeans, who were this. For a different group of people, it was retracting, and that their decision is going to have an impact on the population of Great Britain from now into the future.
Just to switch gears a little bit, to go back to the earlier conversation about opening up space between yourself and the place that you come from in order to sort of use it as material. One of the things that struck me about all of your books is that you all have different sort of techniques for creating distance between the person that you were and the person that you are writing. And sometimes that technique is as straightforward as, I got on a plane and then I ended up in this place and now I'm writing about it. And sometimes the technique is more grammatical. Gerald, in your case, you have these wonderful essays where you switch from the first person into the second person. So these essays that are written in the you that seem to be addressing the reader, describing, but also sometimes commanding. So I would love to just hear all three of you talk a little bit about how, as writers, you think about creating that distance that then allows you to reflect on either making a home out of what is now sort of far away, or unhoming yourselves, creating that sense of disorientation or feeling lost and having to then find some sort of stable place to land.
I'll start. I think I have 5, maybe 6 essays in the second person in that collection. And I get asked about that decision more than anything else when I discuss my book. And I've wondered about that. And people ask if I decided in using the second person, I was attempting to distance myself from the material because some of the material is a little intense. People seem to think that that was a strategy on my part to be able to grapple with a subject matter that might be too harmful by use of the I. And I have so often wanted to claim that that was true because I love it as an answer, but it's not the answer in my case. I wrote my first essay in the collection, How to Make a Slave, in response to someone asking me a question about a post-racial America, and if I believed we had arrived at it when Barack Obama was elected. And I said, no, we have not. But I know the way forward. I know how we can do it. And the person challenged me to write an op-ed instructing people how we can become post-racial. So that necessitated me using the imperative mood, do this, you do this, you do that. Midway through the essay, of course, I realized I couldn't possibly answer that. I couldn't do it because I don't know the way forward. And as often happens when I write an essay, I start in one place and I end somewhere else. So the essay about Barack Obama and post-racial America ended up being an essay about me being Frederick Douglass, no connection whatsoever. So I didn't have a conscious decision to distance myself from the material. But people, I think, for some reason, have found a home in that technique when they read the essays. And I've wondered if it is because there's a certain amount of anxiety caused when you read about someone going through a hardship. And I think people feel that they're objectifying the person and maybe seeing something they shouldn't be seeing, and they feel uneasy about it. But in reading the second person, that they somehow become the writer, the person who had the experience. And I think in some way, for some readers, they see themselves as the subject of the essay and can somehow relate to it more. So while I wasn't trying to do anything with that technique other than writing essays in a creative way, I do believe that I created a space for people to have more comfort with my subject matter by looking at the you as themselves instead of as them looking into my personal life. It's a weird thing.
That's so interesting. I think there is generally, certainly among creative writing students and tutors, an obsession with the second person and the reasons that people write in the second person. But that's so interesting. I think you're right. The only time I do it in my essay collection when I write in the second person is a very brief section, and it's about being harassed on the street. And it's really about the split self. You know, I'm both looking at myself being harassed, but also creating that space for women who are reading it and recognize that experience to enter. You know, you are walking down the street, you know, hear someone catcalling you. But I hadn't thought about it that way. Thank you, Gerald.
You're welcome.
I was just thinking I don't write in the second person much. I think I've done it maybe a couple times, maybe one short sequence in my novel, The Flamethrowers, but I understand the attraction to it and the need for it as a tool. To me, it kind of seems like what one does when writing in the second person is put yourself through a set of paces, whether you're inventing something or re-experiencing something familiar. You're putting yourself through it again with the reader to see what will unfold or what did unfold. I don't really know how to answer the question about the I. I was kind of stuck on something that Aminatta was saying about Americans going to Scotland to visit their, what did you say, their tartan cloth or something?
They always buy their tartan and find their clan.
Yeah, find their clan.
I've been invited to clan gatherings in America as well, which to me fascinating.
I don't mean to throw off the heavy responsibility of Merve's always super intelligent questions, but I was thinking about that because it reminded me of something that comes up both in my novel, The Mars Room, and in the title essay, The Hard Crowd, which is the Irish kids that I grew up with in the Sunset District are Irish Catholic, and they all had to go to Gaelic lessons on the weekends. And by the time the boys are 14 or 15, they get an Aaron Go Bra tattoo, and their fathers are all policemen in San Francisco, and there's a huge amount of Irish pride. I mean, it is just massive, and it's the secret history of San Francisco. It's why George Moscone was assassinated. It has to do with, it's like, for me, it's the Sunset District, and the violence of the Irish clans in San Francisco is just a familiar part of how I grew up. But when I tell, now that I'm a fancy writer and I get to meet actual Irish people and even go to Ireland, when I tell people about the sunset, they laugh knowingly and nod knowingly that only an American working class Irish Catholic would take Gaelic lessons on the weekend. That for them, it's a kind of fetishism that unfolds for the person who maybe never experienced the original thing, or whose ancestors a couple generations back did, and that it's become this kind of fantasy thing. I don't know how to link that to the I, except that I'm not Irish Catholic. I grew up with Irish Catholic kids, and maybe part of sometimes one of the ledgers of the I that I try to activate is that distance. Like, I'm interested in other people, and I always have been. And I try to write about them in the way that they manifest for me as larger than life. And sometimes it requires the bit of a use of an I, but my I is almost never to manifest myself as larger than life, or to share experiences that I've had or things I've thought about that are highly personal. And I think I'm just not that interested in my own life in that way, or it's private or something. So that I is kind of there more in reverence to other people and like witnessing and being interested in their lives than it is about my own.
Actually, Rachel, one thing oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I agree with that. My I is literally my eyes. You know, the essay is this vehicle through which I ruminate. And when Gerald said, when he starts, he always ends in a different place, which is precisely the point of essays. You don't quite know where it's going, and it's this rumination. And you are the eyes and ears for your readers. And, you know, I bring in as much of my own life or experiences makes it relevant, because I think subjectivity is so much part of the way in which we think. You know, and I don't want to hide that thought process from my readers. I want them to know how I'm relating it to my own experience of the world in order to try to make sense of it. But I think the I is the EYI as opposed to the I.
It's a really, really good point. Can I just pop in really quick, Merve? I have a friend who hates memoir, hates personal essays. And the reason is because she believes the writers of these genres are always focused on me, 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 me. I've written 2 memoirs and a collection of personal essays. I take offense by that, because I don't think I've ever written about myself, despite the fact that I write memoirs and personal essays. And I try to stress this to my students, that if done well, a memoir or personal essay is always about the reader. It's always about all of us in some vital way, that the I is really the you. And if I am guilty of writing something that is so focused on me that people can't see themselves in the narrative, then I have screwed up. And I try my best to avoid that.
I agree. I've also written a memoir and a collection of essays, all written in the first person, but I am the narrator. Right, my memoir was not about me, it was about my country, you know, it was about a dictatorship unfolding, it was about a civil conflict. I was the narrator and the witness to it. And much the same as my essays, I am the narrator and the witness, and I was also, you know, trying very hard to do the thinking on it as well. But essentially the I is the narrator.
Well, Gerald, it sounds like you have an answer to your you question there then.
I thought I heard it too when I was speaking.
Yeah, like you have an honest, a truthful answer, an honest answer to the you question, which is that the reason you write in the second person is to stress that the first person also isn't really about you yourself, right? It's to take some of the pressure off of it. I mean, when I was thinking about sort of distancing techniques, it wasn't just about the second person. Rachel, I was thinking about how in your collection, literary criticism, right, becomes a way of focusing on a different kind of object and sort of interspersing that with what you're reporting or what you're remembering becomes another kind of yeah, let's call it a distancing technique, because all of a sudden there's an object that doesn't care at all about your existence, right? A novel doesn't really care who's reading it. And you can read it however you want to, but it doesn't, you know, it's not communicative in the way that other people necessarily are. So was there a kind of rationale for interspersing the literary criticism with those more sort of reported or personal pieces?
Well, I wasn't thinking of the book as being organized according to thematic content, like, oh, I'll include some literary criticism and some personal essays and some nonfiction reported pieces, you know, the kind of stuff that I do on occasion for the New York Times Magazine. It was more that all of it is written by me, and if I choose it to go in the book, then it has something in common with the pieces around it. And some of that for me is frankly just about tone. And if the pieces pass muster for me in terms of tone and share something in common with the tone of the pieces around them, like I knew the essay collection would begin with a first long essay about the Cabo 1000 that I participated in, because it's really about the whole subculture of the motorcycle world in San Francisco and gives a sense of what I was up to before I became a writer. And then from there, like, what tone does that piece end on? And then picking that same tone back up for the beginning of the next essay, and just in relay one thing to the next. And some of those writers, I mean, Marguerite Duras, who I mentioned already, Clarice Lispector, and Dennis Johnson are people who've been really important to me and who I've kind of collected magpie-like along the way, a lot of anecdotes about, and I've read a lot about all of them. And, you know, with Dennis Johnson, had personal interactions with him, and after he died, it seemed like an important opportunity to kind of recatalog who he was as a writer and what that career is really about and what he was about. But I feel like I treat them the same way that I treat, for instance, my friend Alex Brown, whose eulogy is the penultimate essay in the book. And his death really taught me something about death that I didn't know before, which is that I will never understand it. And it's completely mysterious that people disappear from the earth, never to be seen again. But I treated him the same way that I would treat Lispector, Duras, or Dennis Johnson, which is as a kind of larger than life star-like person who continues to interest me even when gone. So I didn't really separate by genre and think, oh, now I'll include these pieces, even though classically maybe you would organize an essay collection by, like, these are my pieces on contemporary art and these are my pieces on literature. It just kind of seemed more boring and dull. And then you would perhaps only interest the people who are interested in literary criticism, whereas my book is truly meant to be for everybody. And all the pieces in it seem like they're kind of stylistically have something in common with one another.
And I'm muted. Sorry, we are over time. So I'm sorry that I didn't offer a more elegant closing comment, but thank you to the three of you for this wonderful conversation. A reminder to the audience that books by all three of the authors can be purchased at the link below. And I hope that wherever everybody is going tonight, it feels at least a little bit like home. So have a good night, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.